It was the talk all off season, Shawn. We talked about what we were going to do throughout it, how we were going to draft these teams. It's week 17. It's time for those teams to make some money, but we're also going to be thinking of ways to make some profits here throughout the playoffs. We are going to be drafting in the Underdog Mitten 2 later in today's show as we work our way through it. They sold out, or they filled the Mitten 1, bigger prize pool, bigger contest for the Mitten 2. So we're going to take our shots at that as well, and we're going to talk about that as we work through it. But Shawn, as we start this show, I mentioned week 17. We talked about the different, permutations, the different matchups, how it could work out, which were the key contests that you wanted to target, how could that fall out and get leverage to other games. We've talked a lot about the New York Jets and the Seattle Seahawks week 17 contest throughout the offseason, but week 17 is here. We have a team in the super flex. We were talking before we started recording this one around the scenarios of Derrick Henry possibly sitting out, who is a key part of this roster that we talked about on our show earlier this week. So we'll see how that plays out closer to the time. But it has been fantastic over the last couple of weeks. We've talked about some of the winners and huge prize money that has been won by certain RotoViz Overtime listeners in the RotoViz community. It has been, I think, the best part of my entire season has been hearing from people how they're doing, how their teams are advancing. Many of the listeners reaching out with those squads as the season went along. I want to give a shout out to some that have reached out over the last couple of days. We have Phil Manor, a regular listener, a long-time listener, 17th at the minute, Shawn, in the FBG tournament over at the FFPC. So really in grasping distance of a top 10 finish, but potentially a top 1 finish, which would bring huge prize money. We talked with Frank Duffy's team recently. He is in the mix over there in the FBG as well, over at the FFPC. So lots of people in the mix, but the real fun ones are some of the different tweets from people saying that, first time maybe playing in it or first time advancing to a final. Just so awesome. Across sites as well, Shawn, we have the Fantasy Viking, who has been a long-time listener again, and this is part of the reason why it's so much fun. Shawn won't have seen this because I only shared it before we started the show, but he shared it out. You, me, the RotoViz Radio team, Tom Strachan, who has been on RotoViz Radio in the past, and of course Ben Gretsch, and he has advanced into the DK Millionaire contest for this coming week. So that's another fun one, and it's just been fantastic to get that feedback of how those teams are going. And across the sphere, Shawn, we could have RotoViz listeners winning all these contests, BBM3, the FFPC Best Ball Tournament, and hopefully we're going to take home that Super Flex one ourselves. But the other fun one to mention is, I don't know if we've ever had a repeat FFPC Main Event winner, Shawn, but last year the Go Bills team won it. They are in the lead. They are in the lead as we enter week 17. Could be a second straight FFPC Main Event for them. When I was at the Fantasy Football Expo earlier this year, I got to meet up with Nick Constantino. He was there and was talking about how the team done last year. And I was like, that's probably never going to happen again, is it? And he's like, we're going for it again this year. And I don't think he thought that entering this week he was going to be in the top spot with that co-managed team that he has. But man, they're back in such an amazing position. So it's great just to see people having so much success, and hopefully that continues into week 17 and beyond. And what a perfect way to start the new year if you can cash in on some of these big tournaments.
It is just so cool. And we've been enjoying with everyone. Congratulations to everyone who's done well. Congratulations to everyone who's made it to the finals of their home league. I mean, that's the basis for all of this and where we start and where we get going. I had a chance to I still have a dynasty league that ends kind of a week early because of the strange new, not strange, but just the new schedule. And one that I do with Ross Miles and some of his buddies from across the pond. And obviously originally met up with Ross back, I think, over a decade ago now, doing some PFF content at that time, and was lucky enough to take that one, the Iron Throne Championship. Obviously, that one just popped out because that had a good result for me last night. Easy front of the mind, and yet all of these fun ones they go through. Mostly, we're going to the finals this next week. Hopefully, everyone is involved in that in some way, shape, or form. And it's been a fun year. It's been a frustrating year in some ways. Even these last couple of weeks have featured more injuries and that weather element where, I mean, this last week, if you had Stephon Diggs, if you had Josh Jacobs, I mean, we don't. It's nice for us that he gets stopped. But if you have those players, if you have Devontae Adams, then, I mean, it's just it's so tough to feel like a different, you just put a roof over and those guys go for 30 points and suddenly you're in such a different situation. So also condolences go out to people who lost. I mean, obviously fantasy football, not as serious as other things in life, but the reason that this endeavor is so fun and the reason that your hobbies mean something to you and give life that oomph and pizzazz is that it does matter. And having that engagement, if you don't care, then you don't do it. It's not any fun. And so we know that is a big blow when you don't make it. And you can't always win. I mean, good teams are playing on both sides. So win or lose, hopefully it brought energy to your week, to your weekend, to your season, to your year. And Colm, we're going to talk about the Mitten now, also the Gauntlet up and running over at Underdog. Some ways to get out there and fill that need to draft and give you a chance to root in the reality playoffs as well. And Colm, there are a lot of fun contests out there. We'll do some FFPC playoff content as well. But I really love this one because you've got to balance actually doing a draft so other players can mess you up. They can interfere with your strategy. And at the same time, you have this really interesting tension between advancing through the first round and then having a team that's set to where you could win the grand prize. Obviously, the incentives are set up to where if you finish in those top handful of spots, that's where you make your money over time by hitting on a few of those over the years. Yep. Obviously, if you advance, you're going to get some money back as well. And that part is important. But managing those two things, I think, is the great part about this tournament. And Colm, you mentioned that the first Mitten filled. One of the things that we discussed in our previous show is that you've got to be able to project forward a little bit and think about what the scenarios are in the playoffs, because the contest is going to fill before you get that certainty. Well, the contest did fill. Obviously, we're on to Mitten 2. I assume that it will also fill very quickly and just be so much fun here. And right now, those final playoff spots very much up in the air. Some teams could have helped themselves last week and didn't. The Detroit Lions obviously jumped in front of mind. The New England Patriots almost staged a frantic comeback, which obviously would leave them feeling better about themselves. It's got to be pretty dark over there right now with the way their last two games have finished. The debacle with the Raiders and then the late fumble when they looked like they had the comeback against the Cincinnati Bengals last week. The Bengals, I really think, are the best team in football right now. Obviously, the Chiefs, the Bills, the Eagles, very, very close. 49ers would put their name in that hat, even with Brock Purdy. And we saw what the Dallas Cowboys could do, even though Gardner Minshew really did a pretty good impression of Jalen Hurts. He doesn't bring quite the rushing upside, and perhaps, I mean, you're going to be able to move the ball with an elite backup, but if you're playing a great team, you just don't have the reps and you don't have the ability to make the perfect decisions. And not that the starters make perfect decisions either, but that small margin, that extra little mistake, even one mistake in a game like the Eagles Cowboys can flip a game. So we'll see how these top teams are playing as we go into the postseason, who we really want to emphasize there. But we also have to look at how do you run it back? How do you get some teams to round out your picks and your squad in 8, 9, and 10? Right? How do we get through the first round? And how do we create some upside if we get some upsets? Because right now it feels like it's a guarantee that you're going to get Eagles or 49ers versus Bills, Chiefs, and Bengals. And I do think that, I mean, obviously the odds are very heavily in that direction. And yet, when we see upsets do happen, especially in the modern NFL. You want your team to be built to where it could take advantage of that if one came to fruition. So, Colm, who are we looking at here? What do you see and what do you like for these last playoff spots on the AFC side to start?
Well, I'm going to flip it back a little bit to you. I think is when we've done this in the past, we've really targeted the Bengals and the 49ers as our key parts of this offense. And as the weeks have gone on, it looks like both of those teams are continuing to solidify their opportunities to make it into the Super Bowl or to have a deep run in the playoffs and also not be that number one overall seed. So kind of fitting all the molds in a perfect scenario. Have you wavered off that? Has that continued to solidify? And the other part that we talked about is, I joked about it last week, the Packers making it ahead of the Detroit Lions. I know we had some conversations last week around, and Mike Evans didn't have a good week 16, but between Mike Evans and Amon-Ra St. Brown, and I was kind of leaning towards the Bucs making it in. Now, there's still chances that they could slip up and not actually get in either. But with those final spots now, some of our teams have involved the Seattle Seahawks, who may be on the outside looking in, but the Chargers obviously are playoff bound. That was another team that we have targeted so far as kind of that wild card weekend team. I think the NFC side of it is very, very interesting. I do think it's a situation where on the Washington team, the side of things, it's hard to get really excited based on the QB situation there. Haven't been a team that we have been trying to target. You're hoping that realistically it's the Lions, the Seahawks, or the Packers that make it in ahead of them. And I think from a fantasy perspective, you're probably hoping more so that it is the Lions or the Seahawks, even though from a reality perspective, I'm wanting it to be the Packers. And then I think that it'll be interesting to start potentially targeting Jacksonville a little bit. Obviously, we get the Jacksonville versus Tennessee game to see who wins that division and gets in. I think that they could be a fun team in that wild card weekend to potentially advance past that stage as a dangerous team with how they have played over the last kind of 4 weeks or so. But how are you feeling about those tail end teams as well? And the original question was, how much are you looking to diversify your portfolio with, for example, the Bengals and the 49ers here?
Yeah, I just find that I'm not that interested in diversifying. I did put an article out on the site looking at how you would attack the top 3 teams. So how you would attack the Eagles, the Chiefs, the Bills, how you would build around them to make that work. So you can both advance through the first round and then have basically that 5-player lineup, because you're going to need to hit on those guys in the Super Bowl. Now, if you're building around those teams, especially the Bills and the Chiefs, you do have some really late options that you can put in there. And we saw last week, Dawson Knox has been catching touchdowns recently. You don't necessarily expect that to continue, as he's not someone who really generates targets very well. And yet that upside is obviously there. You can put him in. The balance, I think, is not feathering in too many of those players, because while it's a perfect build, then once you're in the Super Bowl, it's not great for advance, because you have a lot of exposure to players who in any given week have a very low projection. Now, the argument is that, somebody is going to make it through with a team that has either exclusively Bills, exclusively Chiefs, exclusively Eagles, or a balance of those teams. And you just perfectly thread the needle such that you hit on the exact right guys. And it's almost like rooting for that Minnesota Vikings outcome. We talked about that a little bit on the previous show, where if you hit the scoring that the Vikings managed in their comeback against the Colts, you do that in one of the first rounds, then now you're through with those guys. And once you're even into the second round, it becomes easier. There are fewer players. You're competing against teams that don't have as many live options. And yet there are probably going to be some teams that move through, some teams that advance, that do give people more live options. So the second round still becomes a little bit of a challenge. The 49ers and the Bengals offer you just so many more options, because number one, they still have a good chance to make the Super Bowl. Not as good as the top teams by any stretch, but a good chance. And how good they actually are is going to be very similar, even though the path is going to be more difficult. The other element then is that right now, the Bengals still have a chance of the number 1 seed if they win out. So they could very quickly flip into a situation where they don't have to play both the Chiefs and the Bills, and those teams face each other, would obviously make it much more difficult. If you look at the first half of their game against New England, you'd say, at home, they should be maybe even not heavily favored, but you would definitely give them the edge over the Bills. If they win that game, it throws the entire AFC playoff picture into chaos. And not really chaos, but it definitely has a big impact on how you would want to draft these underdog tournaments, for example. Yeah. So you want to think through that element. The other part that's interesting is trying to decide how the late teams are going to move through the tournament. So the Jaguars now become, I think, an almost must draft. They were the team that, as I did some more drafts myself last week, really trying to emphasize, they're going to have that home game against a 5 seed that is not a dominant team. Now, perhaps if it ends up being the Ravens and Lamar Jackson is back, then it's a more difficult scenario. But you have an opportunity here for this to be the Chargers. And even though they win and win fairly comfortably against the Colts, they look bad. A team that you would really like the Jaguars against in a first round matchup. So then you're suddenly getting 2 games. And once you get into that second game, yeah, you're playing the number 1 seed, but the number 1 seed's had a week off. We know that every once in a while that actually causes a problem for teams. They come out cold, you get behind, and now you have Trevor Lawrence. Maybe you get through a couple games. And if you end up with the Jaguars and the team that comes out of the other side of the AFC, now you're really rocking and rolling as you're going further into the tournament. I think you want to think of that same thing with the Chargers as a possibility, even though I just mentioned that, they don't look hot right now. You flip that over to the NFC side and you think about who the number 7 seed would be. And I think I maybe even explained this inaccurately on one of the previous shows. I know I mentioned at one point the reseeding that happens and how it's going to affect some of the teams, but the Lions, if they go against the Vikings in the first round, or the Packers, they go against the Vikings in the first round and you get a shootout, but you also get a very winnable game. I think the Vikings are something crazy like 11-0 in 1-score games. And I think that does matter. I don't think that we should be saying, oh, the Vikings aren't good. They have Justin Jefferson. That by itself is going to make you a playoff team, but they are beatable. So you have a shootout, you have a beatable team, and then you feed into the Eagles, right? And that's the key here, is that you're going to be reseeded. So you're not going to have to go and hit the 49ers, which you don't want to do. Their defense is going to stop you in your tracks. You play the Eagles, not that they have a bad defense either, but you have a much better chance at the shootout like we saw them play against the Dallas Cowboys. And even there, I think in that shootout, you have this slight chance of advancing. If you play that off of the 49ers, now you have, again, this possibility for 2 teams into the NFC Championship game. It's going to be very difficult to beat you. And if you draft, especially if you're drafting at the $5 level, so you're not spending lots and lots of money. We want to be careful about encouraging people to go out and damage their bankroll or to spend money they don't have. But if you draft a handful of teams and you get multiple teams through, you're betting on a specific scenario, but it's my preference to bet on the scenario as opposed to betting on far weaker players. Because even then, if you have the strong teams come through, but you have players who simply project for very few points, you get the team through, but then you've got guys where they're probably still not going to score for you. So you're going to get beaten by an Eagles, Chiefs, Bills construction that just simply has better players off of those teams.
So Shawn, let's get to the draft. We have the draft in the books. We're going to talk through it in a moment, and we're going to see if this is a team that can win the Underdog 2 Mitten. There is $50,000 up for first prize. There's $250,000 in total prizes. Shawn, we want to be the winners of that first prize. And that brings us to the win bet segment of today's show. Is this team a winner? We're going to give it a rating out of 10 to see what our chances are here, Shawn, as we look to progress. But you can sign up today to receive a special sports offer. Bet $100, win $100. Download the WinBet app now or visit wynnbet.com to start winning. As we look at it, Shawn, we had the 103 while drafting here. We start off with Christian McCaffrey. It feels like at this point, all our drafts, they just have to be Christian McCaffrey in the first round as we take that opportunity. But we get Christian McCaffrey, we go Joe Burrow, then T. Higgins, George Kittle, Brandon Ayuk, Keenan Allen, Devin Singletary in round 7. We'll hold some spoilers for round 8, round 9, round 10 as we go through here. But we start off Christian McCaffrey. We've talked quite a few times about believing in the 49ers and their opportunity to advance deep into this playoffs, potentially, win the whole thing. And so we have taken most of our drafts and focused on the Bengals versus the 49ers in the Super Bowl. But certainly this draft focused around the 49ers and their chances to progress. So we get Joe Burrow as our quarterback, then we go T. Higgins, we get George Kittle, and then Brandon Ayuk. So we've started off out of those first 5 picks, 2 Bengals, 3 49ers. How are you feeling through that point? I think it played out pretty nice through that section of the draft in the opening 5 rounds for us here.
Yeah, I love the way that this draft develops. In the second round there, it's a difficult decision between Burrow and CeeDee Lamb, because if you go McCaffrey, Lamb, there's a chance that Burrow still falls to you, but that is his ADP right where we selected him. If you get both the 49ers and the Cowboys, you could get teams on opposite sides who then progress through. You get the 2 power teams, you have multiple routes, you can build it out in different fashions as you go through the draft. But it does probably lock you out of this other side. Well, really, again, we're building a 49ers-Bengals Super Bowl team. When you draft Joe Burrow at that spot, it's really the perfect place, because then you're going to be able to get T. Higgins. Again, that's right around his ADP as you come back through. That opportunity really too much to pass up. You think about the other kind of best option for a Bengals team, and that would be a Jamar Chase, Joe Burrow team. But to do that, you've got to use your first and second round picks. We were fortunate in the drafter at the 104 did not decide to play Burrow coming back around with Chase. Once you have that first 3 rounds, I mean, you're set up so nicely. Again, unless the Bengals win out and also then get a loss from the Chiefs, you're in a situation where they're going to play in the first week. The 49ers are going to play in the first week. These are the two of the 5 best teams. And arguably right now, the 2 best teams in the NFL. If you can build around them. And again, the thing that helps here is that you can build a powerhouse team around them. Whereas with the Bills, the Chiefs, the Eagles, you kind of got to take more drag types of players in order to round out the roster and get enough exposure to have that as you go forward. Now, of course, if those teams win, you're going to be dealing with other participants who are in the same situation. So it's going to be an apples to apples there. It's going to be an oranges to oranges with managers who are taking this 49ers Bengals route. But I just love this setup. It would have been fun to have been able to get Deebo Samuel coming back in round 4, but especially with the rapport that Kittle and Brock Purdy are demonstrating. I mean, do you want the guy who now is ascending and healthy? One of the things with Kittle is that we watched how it took him a long time to get going after that groin pull. We know that Deebo has dealt with a lot of injuries through the years, has dealt with some nagging injuries this year, and is currently injured. And so even if he comes back and is able to play, I mean, is he a decoy? You don't know. But you do know that George Kittle right now looks like an absolute monster. You know, maybe the most difficult player to account for in the entire NFL when you consider his athleticism at the size. When he goes through some of these stretches where he doesn't score a lot, you tend to forget about it and forget about the fact that he's basically wide receiver athleticism in a tight end's body. That, I mean, it's so dynamic. It's so scary. It's fun to have him on this team and in this roster where obviously touchdowns are going to really differentiate teams. You got to get guys who score. And so we like that. And then coming back around in round 5, you're able to add Brandon Ayuk. Ayuk has been a frustrating player for me this year. I think that week to week, it just ends up being pretty obnoxious the way that he's used, the way that he scores. I don't think that he's necessarily a great fit with Purdy, but he separates. He can make the big play. You need those big plays. You're not looking as much for a guy who's going to get the underneath targets in this half PPR format. And now with our first 5 picks, we have a full Super Bowl roster. And if you get to that point, I mean, you're going to be feeling very, very good.
Yeah, so you mentioned it there. One of the big parts of the strategy, obviously, is that you have to fill out that starting requirements in the Super Bowl. So we have 1 quarterback to this point. We do finish it with 1 quarterback. And if the Bengals don't get there, we are not in contention really for this because we're going to be missing a quarterback slot to start things off. But you're trying to fill that out. Basically, through those picks there, it is setting up that opportunity to fill out that roster because, again, the bet we are making is on the Bengals, the 49ers making it there. You mentioned Deebo Samuel going 1 pick before George Kittle. I do think, though, if you can get a scenario in your target in that offense, if you can get 2 off the tree between Deebo, Kittle, and Ayuk, it's going to be very hard to get the 3 of those on any roster. So I do think it's worked out pretty good to get 2 of those. If it's a 1v1, and I'm going to put a 1-word answer here, Shawn, just the surname of the player. If both are available, Deebo and Kittle, are you leaning Kittle based on what we've seen with Purdy?
Kittle. I've got 1 word. We'll say Kittle.
That's it. So we've got that one done. We do move it on then. We get Keenan Allen, the Chargers and Herbert are heading for the playoffs. And Keenan Allen has had a bit of a resurgence here over the last week. He is, it's almost like back to those Phillip Rivers days. The targets are just coming in a huge influx. We get Keenan Allen there. We go Devin Singletary. Obviously, the Bills are going to be in contention here. You're trying to pair off some of these players that will face off with the Bengals potentially as that progresses to the Super Bowl. Another one of those teams could be the Baltimore Ravens, and J.K. Dobbins fits that mold. We do double up on the Chargers with Mike Williams, who has kind of had a little bit of a tough season with the injuries and then hasn't hit to the extent that people have been hoping since he has come back. But Shawn, you talked about George Kittle and him maybe now only being 100% healthy after working through basically an entire NFL season to this point to get to being 100% healthy. maybe Mike Williams is going through something similar, and in 2 or 3 weeks' time, that might be something that we see him start to have those kind of dynamic performances that we expect from him. We finish off then in round 10 with Samaje Perine to add into our opportunities again for the Bengals to fill out all those spots when it comes to that Super Bowl, because obviously we have full faith the Bengals are going to be there, Shawn. So when we look through it, I think it's interesting with how this roster is played out. I did ask you before we jumped into a recap what you thought of this team. I'm going to let you let the listeners know what you think of it as well. But this is a team that I really like how it played out for us and how the picks went. It didn't feel like there was a huge amount of picks where we thought, oh, we really wanted that one, and then we were left kind of scrambling to see what options were left. I think we got very strong value at a couple of these picks. In particular, Keenan Allen and Devin Singletary felt like they probably should be going a little bit earlier in this format.
They probably should. And we mentioned at the beginning of the show this Chargers opportunity that they could be playing a Jacksonville team where you're going to have a shootout. You have the possibility then of advancing if they're on the opposite side of the Bengals. So if we have, say, Bills, Chargers versus Bengals, Chiefs as the final four on the AFC side, I mean, you're going to heavily give that game to the Bills in terms of how you think it's going to turn out. But if it were to go the other direction, then suddenly now you're set up so nicely for advance to the Super Bowl, which obviously you've got to make it there. And you have so many players that you can rely on. We draft Keenan Allen and Mike Williams together to hopefully have those players at least in the second round. And so you have two guys off of that team who could give you an out in the second round advance, which again is going to be crucial. You look at Devin Singletary. In a lot of the scenarios that remain, you're going to have Bills, Bengals on opposite sides. If the Bills are the number one seed, you're going to have Bengals, Chiefs be the game that in all likelihood feeds into them in the AFC Championship. And so you can have Singletary on one side, the Bengals guys on the other. He gives you a chance to where ideally he would score a lot of points and the Bills would lose since we're Bengals oriented. But he would help you with that advance to the Super Bowl. He also gives you a running back in round 2, because if we have J.K. Dobbins here and he falls out in the first round, we're hoping that he can give us some running back points at the beginning. Again, you have to advance through that first round. You want as many elite talents and guys who could progress. The other thing with Dobbins versus Allen and Williams, if it ends up where the Ravens are playing the Jaguars and do end up taking them down, then you have Dobbins advancing into that second round. In that case, probably a lesser chance that Allen and Williams advance into that second round. And so you have a player there to help you in the flex spot. At that point, you probably are a little overly heavy at the running back position. Ideally, we would just go with 3, but we thought the value was there with Dobbins. And then in the last round, again, you probably are looking at a different position, but among the players who are there and are both guaranteed to make the playoffs, which again, I don't think that you have to take. I mean, you want some of these teams that have players who are maybe in a much more of a contingent type of situation. But with Perine, he's a better fantasy player right now than Joe Mixon if either of those guys are in a vacuum. So basically, Joe Mixon with Perine backing him up is not as good as Perine with the players who would then back him up. We hope that Mixon stays healthy. I have a lot of Mixon in this contest. But if it were to fall the other way, if Mixon were to be dinged up, then suddenly, again, you have a piece of this offense that your scenario depends on, and you have a guy who would be a huge scoring player as you progress through the playoffs.
Yeah, certainly. So we'll see how it plays out. We'll probably do another few of these before it kicks off. But as I mentioned, if you're drafting, people were probably saying, oh, we'll wait in that first one. We'll draft after we know what the playoff seedings are. You don't know what the playoff seedings are. The contest is already filled. We're into the second, Mitten. Get involved. $5 entry into this one. If you are drafting over at underdogfantasy.com, you can use the code RotoViz. We'll get you a 100% sign-up bonus up to $100. And once again, that code is RotoViz. That is going to get us to the end of our third show of the week. It will be our final show before the new year. Obviously, we want to wish our listeners a happy new year, hopefully a successful new year as we head into these playoffs, your dynasty leagues, your redraft leagues, all the different formats. Go get those championships this weekend. We wish you all the best of luck with that. We'll be back in 2023, which sounds a little bit strange, but until we are back, Have a good one.